Hello, my name is Declan Brady and today I'm going to talk about the local government and the War of Independence in Fingal. And I'd like to start by just giving a special word of thanks to Fingal Local Studies and Archives, without whom I would be unable to conduct the research that's needed for my PhD that I'm working on at the moment on local government in Fingal and local politics from 1870 to 1950, and indeed for this talk. I want to begin by giving a little bit of background to Fingal in the early 20th century before I get to talking about the War of Independence and 1920 in particular. Fingal in the early part of the 20th century was largely rural and agricultural, even though it was close to the city. The north and the west of the area was characterised by grazing and cattle fattening, mainly cattle farming, a small amount of sheep farming. The south and east was crop growing, labour-intensive tillage farming, which supplied produce to the brewing and distilling industries in Dublin and the bakery and milling industries, as well as market gardening products, which was effectively food and potatoes for the Dublin market. The only area that had any manufacturing or industrial employment was Balbriggan, and Skerries also depended on Balbriggan. They had hosiery and textile factories, and there was a lot of what would have been called piecework or outwork in cottages in and around Skerries. RIC District Inspector intelligence reports from the time nearly always described the area as being in a usual peaceable state, and that the farmers of County Dublin are all well-to-do men. The land was better, and the profits that could be garnered from agriculture in North County Dublin were better than many other parts of the country, and that characterised the North Dublin area at the time as being largely peaceful. What was probably one of the most important pieces of legislation that was passed in this period was the Local Government Act of 1898. That replaced the grand juries, which were largely, if not exclusively, in some parts of the country there was a number of Catholics who would have sat on grand juries. In the County Dublin grand jury, which had 23 members, there was only 2 Catholics at this particular time. Before 1898, they were responsible for judicial matters as well as significant infrastructure like road building, the upkeep of bridges, harbours, prisons and asylums. You also had at the time the poor law unions or poor law guardians, which had originated in 1838 with the Poor Law Act and were responsible for taking care of the poor of the parish, which had previously been done by the Church of Ireland. There was 166 poor law unions were set up, and poor law guardians were half elected and half appointed as the senior ratepayers in the area. In the 1850s and 1860s, they began to take on some of the responsibilities that we would now associate with local authorities, things like housing and public health. In 1898, the Local Government Act replaced both the grand jury and the poor law unions, or the poor law guardians, with county councils and rural district councils. There was already some corporations and urban district councils before that. It brought representation to a fully elected body for the first time in Ireland, but it also brought a taxation burden. It brought authority and opportunity for those who wanted to get involved in local politics, but it also brought additional oversight and control by the local government board. It was effectively a balancing act between local and national participation in government. Pádraig Travers called it a bloodless revolution, and it formed the political landscape that persisted right up until the present day. Michael Davitt of the Land League, in his book The Fall of Feudalism in 1904, called it the greatest of all victories won by Irish forces. In the latter part of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, in the Fingal area of North County Dublin, 2 men really dominated politics, although not directly in local politics, but they pulled the strings behind. One was J.J. Clancy, who was the local MP and had been since 1886 until he lost his seat in 1918. The other was a significant farmer, tenant farmer, Andrew Kettle, who had a number of farms together with his family throughout the North County Dublin area, and had been a close disciple and confidant of Charles Stewart Parnell in the tenant rights organisations in the 1870s, in the Land League, and subsequently in the Home Rule movement. Apart from being a largely quiet and peaceable area, there was a couple of things that did happen that were particularly noteworthy in the Fingal area, and they colour local politics right up until, and local animosities as well, right up until the period of 1920 and beyond. One was the lockout and strike in Fingal in 1913. This was part of the general strike and lockout that occurred in Dublin City, but had included farm labourers in the North County. What was significant was they were looking for better terms and conditions of employment and also increased wages, as well as recognition. They were members of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. The strikes in North County Dublin, when a lot of labourers were locked out and some of them were evicted, because remember they would have lived in cottages on particular farmlands that they worked on. What was significant about this was they didn't target the traditional unionist or conservative landlords, they targeted the strong tenant farmers. And as an area that was characterised by tillage farming, there would have been very much a labour intensive dimension to it. Some of the animosity from that, as I said, extends right into much later in the 20th century. The strike began in August of 1913. There were riots and swords. There was a shooting in Fingal in October of 1913. But by January, February and a harsh winter, it started to fizzle out. A lot of men were evicted. A lot of men were dismissed from their positions on farms, and they ended up leaving the area, some of them. But as I said, the bitterness remained. In 1916, the Fingal Battalion distinguished itself by fighting at the Battle of Ashbourne, the only successful engagement during Easter week. About 60 men mobilised at Knoxydam Bridge on Easter Monday. About 20 odd of them ended up fighting in the city in the Mendicity Institute under Captain Richard Coleman. Some of the individuals that I have here on this particular slide are the leaders who would have been involved at that particular time. The battalion was led by Thomas Ashe, a school teacher originally from County Kerry, but who was based in Lusk. And he was also involved with the Black Raven Pipe Band and was a senior member of the Gaelic League and the Irish Volunteers. Dr. Richard Hayes, there on the top left-hand corner, was the medical officer in Balroddery Union Workhouse. Probably the most significant of all the individuals in terms of his political profile and his political activities was Frank Lawless, who's there. And the men in the middle are the members of the Swords Company, the Irish Volunteers. Now, local government in the period 1899 to 1920 didn't really change in terms of the personnel and who was running the councils. You largely had a council, initially with a number of unionist councillors, but over time and after various triennial or 3-yearly elections, the number of unionists diminished and the number of nationalists increased. For instance, P.J. O'Neill, who farmed about 140 acres in Kinseely, was chairman of Dublin County Council continuously from 1899 through to 1920. Michael Dunn was chairman of Balroddery Rural District Council continuously from 1912 to 1920, and Thomas Smith was chairman of Balroddery Poor Law Guardians. The Poor Law Guardians in 1898 lost all of their responsibilities for what we would call local authority matters and concerned themselves then with just poor law relief, welfare issues and the running of the workhouse. The last election before 1920, because of the war, was the one in 1914. And Balroddery elected a woman for the first time, Molly Eireann, and also elected its first Sinn Féin councillor, Frank Lawless. It was characterised in the newspapers at the time as a defeat for Larkinism. any of what we would now call socialist candidates were defeated in the elections. And the same core of councillors who were largely tillage farmers, largely strong tenant farmers in North County Dublin, had effective control of both Dublin County Council, even despite there being unionist councillors from the townships in Dublin, but between South Dublin and the North County, the farmers held sway, and similarly in Balroddery. When the rising took place in 1916, the response initially of Balroddery Rural District Council was one of horror, and they passed a motion which condemned those who were involved in the rising as the dupes of wily German agents, the foolish dupes of wily German agents. This was passed by Michael Dunn and seconded by PJ Kettle, another North County Dublin farmer from the Lees in just outside Swords, who was a cousin of Tom Kettle, the politician, and a nephew of Andrew Kettle. A year later, when Thomas Ashe died on hunger strike in Mountjoy prison, they rescinded that particular motion and condemned the treatment that he had received at the hands of the authorities in the prison when he died of the effects of force feeding. I want to just move to Frank Lawless, because Frank is probably the key person in local politics from about 1914 on until his death in 1922. His father Joseph had been a poor law guardian. Frank himself had been seconded after his father's death, or co-opted onto the Rural District Council and the Poor Law Guardians. They would have had dual memberships of both. But he's involved in almost every single organisation at the time that has a bearing on the Irish Revolutionary period. He was a farmer. They farmed about over 200 acres, 209 acres in fact, at Saucerstown just outside Swords, and he was also a butcher. The family purchased that farm under Land Act legislation in 1909. He was a member of the Gaelic League, as were members of his family. He was a member of the GAA and was one of the founding members of Fingalian's GAA club in Swords, but he was also a member of the Keating's GAA club. And the GAA would have been used as a cover and as a networking facility for those who eventually became involved in the Irish Volunteers. He was a member of the County Dublin Farmers Association, which was a strong lobby group in terms of Dublin farmers, and the United Irish League, which was the grassroots equivalent of the Irish Parliamentary Party. Joining Sinn Féin in 1906, one of the earliest members, he was elected to the Sinn Féin executive in 1911 and was actually their spokesman for agriculture. Bureau of Military History witness statements indicate that he was an IRB centre as early as 1908, and in 1915 he was a member of the General Executive of the Irish Volunteers, as you can see from that convention piece there in the Irish Volunteer. He is mentioned in quite a lot of police surveillance records, DMP records, in 1915 and early 1916, where he has made contact with some of who we later know as the leaders of the Rising. He fought at the Battle of Ashbourne in 1916. He was quartermaster of the Fingal battalion, and all his family were involved. His wife, his daughters, he had sisters involved, his brother Ned, his brother James, and his sons. So you had, in fact, Colum mustered in 1916 but was sent home because he was too young. He was arrested in 1918 as part of the German plot arrest. He had served his time after 1916 in prison in England, and when the election came in 1918, even though he was still in prison, he defeated J.J. Clancy by a margin of about 2-1 and topped the poll. He only came home just before the election because he accompanied the body of Richard Coleman, who had died of pneumonia-related influenza at Usk Prison just before the election in December 1918. Now, those 73 Sinn Féin MPs who were elected on an abstentionist platform, and they chose not to go to Westminster, but instead they met those who were at liberty in the Mansion House on the 21st of January 1919. Frank Lawless wasn't there because Frank Lawless had returned to prison and his parole had finished. He had only been allowed home on compassionate leave. The key man in that photograph there is in the second row, second from the left. You'll see him there. He's wearing a white scarf. Is Kevin O'Higgins. In April of 1919, William T. Cosgrave, who was also in prison at the time of the meeting of the first Dáil, was appointed the Minister for Local Government, and Kevin O'Higgins was appointed as his assistant. They're the two men that are key in terms of the local government activity and the local government involvement in the Irish Revolution in the period 1919 to 1922. Now, fairly quick, on the same day that the Dáil met, there were two RIC men were shot dead in Solahad Beg in County Tipperary, and a combination, even though they were unrelated at the time, combination of the sitting of the Dáil and those killings is marked as the beginning of the War of Independence. Now, it doesn't take very long for the War of Independence in Fingal to manifest itself. The photograph in the middle there is Collinstown Aerodrome, which is now Dublin Airport, and it was a major British Army garrison at the time. It would have had up to 300 to 400 British soldiers that were stationed there. It had been a Royal Flying Corps base during the Great War. And in early 1919, it was being developed and further developed as an aerodrome, so there would have been a lot of people building there. There was a raid there in March, 30 IRA men, accompanied by a number of local IRA men from the Fingal area who would have operated as lookouts and as drivers, and they got away with 80 rifles and ammunition. However, immediately after the raid, the 800 local workers who were involved in the construction project were all sacked and replaced by military workers, and that would have caused a lot of dissension. It would have caused a lot of hardship in the local area here and resentment. The Fingal IRA had very slowly began, as the Irish Volunteers in 1917, to reorganise itself under Michael Lynch. Michael Lynch was then seconded in 1918 to the Dublin Brigade under Dick McKee, and Daniel Brophy took over. Now, Daniel Brophy had fought in the Rising in 1916 in the city and had been heavily involved in canvassing for Frank Lawless. He took over when Michael Lynch moved to Dublin, and he was involved on and off in most of the early activities in 1919. Frank's son, Joseph Lawless, was also involved in the IRA. He moved into the city and he operated a bomb factory together with Archie Heron, directed by Michael Lynch, from a bicycle shop in Parnell Street. Now, during the period of the War of Independence, as matters escalated, more and more British troops were sent to Ireland, and in addition to the 300 odd troops that would have been in Collinstown, you had a base which, although not directly in Fingal, would have had a large effect on Fingal, and that was the other aerodrome at Gormanstown. Now, eventually, in the middle of the War of Independence, Gormanstown became the central depot for the Black and Tans. There was no auxiliaries or Black and Tans officially based in the North County area, but because of the proximity of Gormanstown to Balbriggan, you would have had a lot of incursions, as indeed you had from the city. But you also had other areas in the North County that would have had significant garrisons of British troops. The building on the left there is where, actually it's where Fingal County Hall is now. That was Swords House, which was Colonel Fitzeustace Forster's house. He had died in 1915, but his house was used as a billet for British troops, and the remount depot, which had about 30 to 40 troops, just outside of Lusk. Now, initially, the Dáil government concerned itself with attacking the Crown system in terms of its legal system and also in raising funds, and would have instituted what became known as the Republican loan in the summer of 1919. And in fact, the first Department of Finance was in this building in Harcourt Street, famous as it had a Sinn Féin bank on the outside. Now, in September, the Dáil was proclaimed effectively being banned, and on that particular day there was also a raid, and that raid took place in the Sinn Féin headquarters, and one of the secretaries there was Evelyn Lawless, who was a daughter of Frank Lawless, and she was a secretary to Michael Collins. And the accounts that we know of that particular day is that Collins escaped and Evelyn Lawless hid his revolver in her stocking. Now, a couple of months later, her father and a number of MPs, who are now TDs, were in the building in November, and they were all arrested. And there are some newspaper photographs. The quality is not fantastic, but if you look at the top right hand there, you see a man in a pinstripe overcoat. That's Frank Lawless at the point at which he was taken away in a British Army truck and sent to prison for being part of an illegal gathering and an illegal organisation, that being Dail Eireann. He was released in February, and there's some quite unusual photographs, not very common, of him being released with fellow TDs at the time. And there's actually a photograph of him there. I've managed to get a slightly better version of it on the right hand side of his daughter greeting him as he came out of Mountjoy prison. The brigade activity reports for Fingal in the period of the War of Independence recall about 16 operations, which is not a lot compared to other parts of the country. They're mostly sporadic and isolated attacks on enemy barracks. And then just before the truce, there's an increase in the level of activity, and 6 Coast Guard stations and the remount depot at Lusk were all attacked, burnt down, and there was a combined malicious injury claim for them of about £64,000. Now, General Richard Mulcahy was very critical of the levels of activity during the War of Independence in the Fingal area. Now, the proximity to Gormanstown and the Black and Tans from mid-1920, as well as increased general British military activity after September 1920 and the sack of Balbriggan, play a part, but also the topography does, because the area lacks in mountains, it lacks in forestry, and it lacks in cover to support flying columns. There's also some evidence in the Bureau of Military History witness statements that Michael Collins had asked that the area be kept quiet, that there be no provocation to the British, lest they declare it a military zone, as it was an important escape route for people coming out of the city. Remember, on the south side you had the Dublin Wicklow Mountains, and on the western approaches you had what was then Royal Barracks and Richmond Barracks and the Curragh. So in terms of being a strategically important quiet area, Fingal satisfied that for Collins. This caused a certain amount of dissension among the leadership in Fingal, among those who wanted to be more aggressive, and some of them ended up leaving and just joining the Dublin City Brigade. Now, in total there was about 700 British soldiers who were stationed in the North County area during the War of Independence. The South Wales Borderers had about 230 men between Swords, Gormanstown and Skerries, and it was about 480 of the East Surreys and later the Duke of Wellington's own at Collinstown and the Remount Depot. During the War of Independence, there would have been splits in terms of personalities who were involved in local politics. There were those who were either Sinn Féin members or Sinn Féin leaning, and then there were those who were not. And a number of sitting councillors would have been targeted by the IRA as being enemy agents. The county sheriff at the time was Colonel Healy Hutchinson from Lisson Hall in Swords. He was listed in one set of documents as an enemy agent, as was James Dickey and Richard Butler, who was president of the Irish Farmers Union and lived just outside of Skerries. And in fact, if you look at the bottom here, I don't know how clear it is because this is taken from an original, but Malahide Golf Club was actually listed as an enemy social institution because it was frequented by British soldiers. All of the station masters in the railway stations and the postmasters and postmistresses are also listed as potential enemy agents. The Local Government Act of 1919 introduced proportional representation of the single transferable vote in order to try and stymie the rise of Sinn Féin and also to protect unionists by eliminating any particular surge in relation to a first past the post method. And we still have that method in Ireland today, even though Britain doesn't. There were two sets of elections to take place in 1920, the municipal and urban district council elections in January and county council elections in June, which included Balroddery and North Dublin Rural District Council. Now, in the January elections, one man who was elected was James Vincent Lawless, a brother of Frank. James was the Assistant Secretary and Assistant County Accountant in Dublin County Council and had been for the best part of, which would have been about 10 to 12 years at this stage. He was first employed around 1908 or 1909 on the casting vote, by the way, of P.J. O'Neill. Now, he was dismissed from his post for his part in the Rising and later reinstated. He was elected as a town councillor for Dublin Corporation in the North Dock ward in the city. In effect, he didn't really attend many meetings in Dublin City Council or Dublin Corporation as it was then, because he spent most of the next 2 years in and out of prison or involved in his duties with Dublin Corporation. Now, one of the things he did when he was in that position at Dublin County Council was he reported directly to Michael Collins on matters of an intelligence nature. And what he actually did was he would take the motor tax records and supply the registration numbers of army vehicles and military vehicles to Collins so that they would be easily, particularly unmarked vehicles that were used by G-men or that were used by British secret agents, and also records relating to the laying of telegraph wires so that they could be cut. He was appointed to the Commission on Local Government, which was set up in April. Frank was originally part of that commission, but due to him being in prison and because he needed to attend to his farm, he had to resign his position. But James Lawless sat on it, as did from the North County area Richard Hayes. Matters escalated then in terms of the IRA policy of burning RIC barracks that were evacuated. So there was about 300 of them were burned in and around March of April, and that brought a response from the British in terms of stepping up criminal injuries claims against the councils. This was really an attack on the ordinary people by the British. This legislation had existed for some time, for at least 2 or 3 years, but it was only utilised to its fullest at this particular time. So as you had buildings that were damaged, as you had the IRA beginning to blow up roads, the people who ended up paying for the repair were the ordinary ratepayers, the ordinary citizens. So you had damage being done by the British and you had damage being done by the IRA, but all the time the cost was being sent by the British government back to local government. There's a letter there from, an extract of a letter from Harry Boland, which, written in and around March of 1920, emphasises how important they saw the role that local government would play. The National Arbitration Courts, later known as the Sinn Féin Courts, were also, at this time, put in place to adjudicate on mostly land disputes. There was very, very few of them recorded in the North County or Fingal area, mainly because of the levels of military activity by the British, and also because of the proximity to the city. So a lot of cases in the North County would have actually been handled in the city courts. In June, when the elections took place for Dublin County Council, you had a complete change in relation to the makeup of those councils, and the old nationalists, the Home Rulers, those who supported John Redmond, were completely swept aside. Dublin County Council returned 12 Sinn Féin members, 2 Labour Republicans, both from the Swords constituency, which was the constituency for the whole of North County Dublin, 2 nationalists and 3 unionists. One of the unionists was Lady Margaret Dockrell, whose brother had been William Shannon, who had been a long time county solicitor up until early 1920 for Dublin County Council. They elected Henry Friel, who had also been elected for Howth Urban District Council, as chairman. He was a civil servant who had been dismissed for refusing to take an oath of allegiance to the British government, and as vice chairman was James MacNeill, the brother of Owen MacNeill. Now, he was a returning senior civil servant and diplomat who had spent a lot of his time in the British colonial service in India. And what's significant is that neither of these are involved in local politics up to 1920. They are Sinn Féin candidates coming from the outside, but they are men of experience and men of ability. One of the Labour Republicans that was elected was a local man, P.J. Curran, who was elected for the Swords constituency, and he is actually marked out as somebody who is on almost every committee that it's imaginable to be on. He's a trade union official. He becomes a TD later in the 1920s for a very brief period, and then loses his seat later in the second election in 1927. Dublin County Council immediately pledged their allegiance to the Dáil, and against the dissension of the 2 nationalists and 3 unionists, that was passed. Each one of the rural district councils also had an ex officio seat on the council, so you had an extra 5 Sinn Féin councillors, and they co-opted a further 2 Sinn Féin councillors as well. Balroddery, for its part, elected 10 Sinn Féin and 7 Labour, and at the time Fingal and predominantly Balroddery is characterised by a very, very strong Labour vote and Labour presence on the council, and this persists well up into the 1920s, and a lot of this is due to the fact that you did have the splits and animosities in relation to labourers and tenant farmers that I mentioned earlier. And my analysis in other areas has shown that there was always that strong Labour vote, which may have moved from Sinn Féin and eventually to Fianna Fáil, but that particular constituency was always there significantly in the Balroddery area. The one nationalist who managed to retain his seat was Michael Dunn. They immediately declared their allegiance to the Dáil, and Balroddery Poor Law Guardians did likewise. Now, elected as chairman of Balroddery Rural District Council was Peter Kelly, a member of the IRA and a 1916 veteran, and vice chair was William Ganley, who had returned from Argentina, was a member of Sinn Féin. He had farmed in Argentina in the late 19th century, had left the United Irish League and supporting the whole rural movement to join Sinn Féin, and he was actually interned in Frongach after 1916, even though he had no involvement in the rising, and he was actually the first secretary of the prisoners group in Fingal. In the Poor Law Guardians, at their meeting, Molly Eireann was elected chairperson, the first woman to be elected chairperson of any Poor Law Guardians, and Lily Fogarty was elected deputy vice chair. In that photograph there, you can see Molly Eireann in the 1920s at a Cumann na mBan commemoration. She had worked as a messenger in the with Cumann na mBan in the 1916 rising. And the oath of allegiance at that time was delivered in Irish by Lily Fogarty, who was a Gaelic League member and an Irish school teacher. And significantly, Molly Eireann then recited a prayer, the Hail Mary, and said, "This is now the prayer and the religion of the Poor Law Guardians." That would have been illegal under local government board legislation. Balroddery Rural District Council and Balroddery Poor Law Guardians didn't have too many meetings. They were very, very quickly, the boardroom and indeed the workhouse was occupied very quickly by the British, who stayed for a period of time and used it as a billet. The inmates were moved out. Some of them remained for a short period of time, but mainly older inmates who were confined to the hospital. And it means that in this difficult period in 1920, there is a paucity of records, because the records, literally, either the meetings aren't there, the meetings are very, very badly attended. For instance, the vice chairman of Balroddery Poor Law Guardians was Daniel Brophy, who we've met earlier in relation to the IRA, and he was rarely at meetings, as he was mostly on the run or in prison. Declaring allegiance to the Dail Eireann government meant that you were breaking with the local government board, and that meant that you then had to submit your papers, you had to submit your orders, you had to submit everything you did to the Department of Local Government of Dail Eireann rather than the local government board. And that brought its own responsibilities. If they thought that Dail Eireann would be any lighter in terms of its management than and its oversight than the local government board, they were very much mistaken, and an awful lot of what they did in terms of normal business was questioned by particularly Kevin O'Higgins. Balroddery Rural District Council, again, they would have done small things in order to let the people know that they had made this change of allegiance. For instance, they started using letterheads in Irish. That photograph there is a group of staff and some guardians just after 1923, 1924. One of the important things about breaking with the local government board was the response that it brought from the British, and that response was the cessation of grants. About 20% of the income for county councils and rural district councils came from grants, the rest came from the rates. And this is where the war is really fought, on that front in terms of the rates. On the 22nd of November 1920, there was a raid on Dublin County Council, and it's reported in the minutes by H.J. Clancy, the secretary, Herbert Clancy, who in fact was a son of J.J. Clancy, the former MP, who said that persons unknown had come into his office in Dublin County Council, which was in Parnell Square, and had taken away the rate books and the financial records. The following day, there was a raid by the British military looking for those same records and couldn't find them, took a lot of other records. And even my work with Dublin County Council records and Balroddery records, there are a number of books missing. There are a number of books where there are pages have been torn out, or there are literally just a one-page set of minutes. Who attended, a certain motion was passed, meeting was adjourned. What becomes important then is the British, in terms of claiming malicious injuries and criminal injuries monies, under a system that allowed them to go to the treasurer of the council and get paid from there. So, for instance, if you had your rates and your rates are lodged with a particular bank, it was the Northern Bank in relation to Balroddery, and the British were looking for criminal injuries claims, instead of being paid by the council, they could go straight to the accounts of the banks. And that's the reason why all the treasurers were removed and they were put into accounts elsewhere in the names of the chairman and trustees that were appointed by the various councils. That provided, literally, very, very simply, a rates war. And it was the rates war that was eventually won that had a big effect on bringing local government from the control of the British under the Local Government Board into the control of Dail Eireann, and that's why it's so critical. Monies could be safeguarded in that particular way, but there were people who ended up caught in the middle, and the people that were caught in the middle were the ratepayers, the rate collectors. The rate collectors themselves had paid sureties, and they would also be due to pension entitlements. So they were now being told that you have to lodge your money to a Dail Eireann or a county council, Sinn Féin run account rather than to a local government board account. They were left in the middle. Kevin O'Higgins had a very, very simple view of that. They were part of the national struggle and they were traitors if they didn't lodge their money. Dublin County Council, to its credit, recognised that these men were not Republican fighters. That's not what they had signed up for. They were effectively employees, and they were a little bit more liberal in relation to dismissing them. All of the Dublin County Council rate collectors actually resigned. Some of them were re-employed, but a lot of IRA men were subsequently re-employed as rate collectors then for Dublin County Council. And one of the Shoulders brothers, who was appointed together with Michael Rock, who was in the IRA in Fingal, actually commented in their Bureau of Military History witness statements that their methods were more effective than the methods of the previous incumbents. There were also alternative sources of funding that were available. Andrew Jemison, for instance, who lived in Sutton, was the director of the Bank of Ireland, and he was prepared to lend money to both the Dail and Dublin Corporation, and some of that found its way through to other councils that were in need of funding as well. In August of 1920, the British introduced the Restoration of Order in Ireland Act and was guillotined to Parliament, and that introduced internment and gave military courts power to try capital cases, and that caused a significant number of arrests across all of the country, and that would have also decimated those members of the local councils who were involved in the IRA. On the 20th of September 1920, RIC Head Constable Peter Burke and his brother Sergeant Michael Burke were drinking in Mrs. Smith's public house in the square in Balbriggan, where there were a number of auxiliaries already drinking. There was an altercation, the Republican police were called, a gunfight ensued, and the two Burke brothers were killed. The auxiliaries in the Black and Tans later that day attacked the town of Balbriggan. There was £200,000 worth of damage done. 30 houses in Clonard Street were burned. 4 public houses, including that of John Derham, who was a Balbriggan Town Commissioner, and his son Michael James Derham, and the English-owned hosiery factory, as well as the killing of Sean Gibbons and Seamus Lawless, 2 known IRA suspects who were taken from their homes and beaten to death. Now, the reaction in terms of that, possibly because of its proximity to Dublin, meant that it got significant newspaper coverage. It was a stepping up and an escalation of matters, and there was a number of high-level political visits from US House of Representatives and senators, which got it worldwide coverage. Around the same time, there's an escalation. Towards the end of October, Terence McSweeney died after 74 days on hunger strike in Brixton Prison, and that got coverage all around the world. Le Petit Journal, a French newspaper there, showing a depiction of him dying. And on the same day as the sack of Balbriggan, Kevin Barry was arrested for his part in an abortive raid on a British military, actually it was a bakery collection in at the corner of North King Street and Church Street, and he was tried, found guilty, and he was hanged in November. So you have constantly an escalation. You also have issues in relation to the rates. Dublin actually had a very good rates collection record. You have to remember that you also had loyal members who didn't see paying the rates to Dail Eireann or Sinn Féin controlled councils as the right thing to do. It wasn't proper law and order. They would pay them to the government, and as you always have in these situations, you have some people who will take advantage of the uncertainty just not to pay at all, and you have a number of farmers who are objecting to paying rates because they think they're too high. On the 21st of November, what became known as Bloody Sunday occurred in Dublin, when in the morning 14 British agents were killed by Michael Collins' squad. Later that afternoon, there were 14 civilians killed at a football match between Dublin and Tipperary in Croke Park, and a significant number of people were wounded. The story around Bloody Sunday and Croke Park and the killings in the morning is quite well known. What's not as well known is the retaliations that took place later that day in North County Dublin. The Star Pub and Swords was burnt to the ground. It belonged to Mark Taylor, and his 3 sons were in prison for IRA membership at the time. His drapery shop was also burnt down, and his truck was dismantled. The Duff household on the main street in Swords, Thomas Duff's house, was also burnt down. Jack Rover McCann was taken from his mother-in-law's house in Rush that night into a field, and he was killed. Jack Rover McCann was also a member of the IRA. There was reprisals in Skerries the same night. William Ganley, the Vice Chairman of the Rural District Council, his farm, outbuildings and barns were burned, and Patrick Matthews, who was a Labour member, Labour councillor, was attacked and shot at home in Skerries. He was a trade union official. Later in December of 1920, Thomas Hand was also killed by the British, and he was a trade union official from Skerries and also was a Sinn Féin court judge. At the end of the year, in December 1920, there was a number of raids on Balroddery boardroom in the workhouse, and Molly Adrian, together with James Stack, the clerk, and 2 journalists who were there, were all questioned and held at gunpoint and searched by, as they described it, men in trench helmets and with bayonets. That is a picture of the site now where the Balroddery Union Workhouse is. There's nothing there. The workhouse, after the British had left, was vandalised and fell into disrepair. It was still used for a number of years as the boardroom, but was demolished in the 1930s because it was being occupied by squatters. So when we look at local government and the War of Independence, it is stop, start, but it sends out very, very significant messages in terms of the country changing its allegiance to the new state, to Dail Eireann. So local government had a crucial role in mass mobilisation and civil disobedience in 1920 that was part of bringing the British to the negotiating table in 1921. Culture and sporting organisations and trade unions also had a role in this, and it's a cumulative effect of all of them and not just the military campaign. But it was a high price paid by the councils, by council members, in terms of the depletion of services, and a high price paid by its citizens. Everybody played a part, everybody paid a price, whether it was voluntary or not. Thank you.